The world was about to witness a moment that would change the course of American politics forever. The camera zooms in on a crowded Senate hearing room, filled with political figures, journalists, and activists. The air is thick with tension. At the front of the room stands Elizabeth Warren, her eyes sharp, her posture poised. Across from her, Ted Cruz shifts in his seat, a smug grin spreading across his face, as if he's already won. Senator Warren, known for her unwavering stance on corporate regulation, prepares to speak. Her voice cuts through the murmur of the room like a blade. This isn't just about policy, she declares, eyes locking on Cruz. This is about the future of every American who's been crushed under the weight of corporate greed. A pause. The room falls silent. Ted Cruz's smile widens. He leans forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And here we go. The queen of regulation herself, speaking as if she's the voice of the people. But let's be real, Senator. You don't care about the people. You care about control. You want to build an empire of government bureaucrats that suffocates the very spirit of entrepreneurship that made this country great. The words hang in the air like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown in front of her. But Warren doesn't flinch. She leans into the microphone, her voice calm, yet filled with undeniable authority. You're wrong, Senator Cruz. I'm fighting for the people who have been left behind, the workers, the families, the immigrants, the ones who are ignored while billionaires like you get richer. It's not about control. It's about fairness. It's about justice. Cruz's smirk falters for just a moment. The room holds its breath. And then, in a split second, the game changes. Cruz leans back, a flash of anger cutting through his eyes. Justice? What a joke. You think you're saving America, Elizabeth? But all you're doing is destroying the very thing that makes us great, freedom. The challenge is made. The stage is set. But what happens next leaves the entire room in stunned silence. The eyes of the nation are fixed on this moment. The clash between these two political titans is more than just a debate, it's a battle for the very soul of America. The camera pulls back to show the full Senate hearing room, the long rows of empty seats, the bright lights above, the muted hum of whispers. But this isn't just any ordinary hearing. This is the battle for America's economic future. And what happens here today will resonate far beyond the marble walls of Washington, D.C. Elizabeth Warren and Ted Cruz aren't just representatives of political parties, they are the faces of two radically different futures. On one side, Warren stands for the millions of Americans crushed under the weight of corporate greed. She's a champion for those whose voices have been drowned out by the billion-dollar lobbies and corporations that dominate every facet of life, from healthcare to housing, from education to the job market. On the other side, Cruz fights for the freedom of the market, the free reign of corporations to make profits without government interference. To him, regulation is the enemy, a force that stifles growth, innovation, and the spirit of entrepreneurship that has long been the heartbeat of the American dream. And this isn't just some theoretical battle. It's a matter of life or death for millions of working-class families, small business owners, and consumers who struggle every day against the monopoly power of the big corporations. The data is staggering. In 2023, just a handful of corporations controlled nearly half of the American economy. From tech giants like Amazon and Google, who dominate entire industries, to pharmaceutical companies that set sky-high prices for life-saving drugs, corporate power has become so concentrated that it's suffocating competition. Small businesses are closing at an alarming rate, unable to compete with the deep pockets of their larger counterparts. Consumers are left with fewer choices, higher prices, and weaker protections. Warren knows this. Her fight is personal. Her father was a small business owner, and she watched him struggle against the banks and insurance companies that nearly ruined him. She's seen firsthand how the system is rigged, how the deck is stacked against anyone who isn't rich or well-connected. But Cruz has spent his entire career defending these same corporate giants. He argues that regulations are just a veil for government control, that they kill jobs, stifle innovation, and rob the American people of their freedom. To him, the idea of corporate regulation is a slippery slope toward socialism. To Cruz, there's nothing more dangerous than a government that controls the economy. But here's the real danger: the stakes are much higher than a simple philosophical debate about regulation. The future of America's democracy is on the line. We are no longer just talking about the free market, we're talking about a political system that has become so deeply intertwined with corporate interests that it no longer serves the people. The very foundation of American democracy is at risk when a handful of corporations control the levers of power. The country is watching. And what happens next will decide whether the people or the corporations will shape the future. This was not just another hearing, this was the defining moment in the battle over America's economic future. The outcome would determine whether small businesses, workers, and consumers could finally rise up against the unchecked power of the corporate elite, or whether the system would continue to favor the wealthy few. Warren isn't just fighting for a policy, she's fighting for a new vision of America. A vision where the American dream is still possible for everyone, not just for those with the deepest pockets. And Cruz? He's fighting to preserve the status quo, to keep the chains of corporate dominance firmly in place, ensuring that the rich get richer while the rest of the country is left to fend for itself. Both sides know the weight of what's at stake. The air in the room grows heavier. The clock is ticking. The country is waiting for the first blow to fall, and this fight is about to go from a political debate to an all-out ideological war. Ted Cruz didn't rise to power by playing it safe. He wasn't born into the political establishment, he was a product of it, a man shaped by the very forces he now defends. Cruz's story began in the heart of Texas, where the ideals of personal freedom, self-reliance, and a relentless disdain for government intervention were passed down like sacred values. From a young age, Cruz was taught that the government's role in the economy was not to intervene but to step aside. His beliefs about the free market were absolute, a system where businesses, unshackled by regulation, could operate without restraint. Cruz's political career began with an ideological firestorm. A graduate of Princeton and Harvard Law, he built a reputation as a brilliant but fiercely libertarian mind. His early days in the legal world were marked by his opposition to government overreach and his advocacy for individual freedoms. But as Cruz moved into politics, his views became more hardened, and his ambition grew sharper. He was determined to reshape America in his image, a place where the government was as small as possible, and corporate giants were free to flourish unchallenged. In the Senate, Cruz became the face of the anti-regulation movement. His fiery speeches, filled with promises of a free market paradise, appealed to his base. He argued that regulation was the enemy of innovation, that it was the government's heavy hand that stifled progress. Cruz argued for tax cuts for corporations, deregulation of industries, and the dismantling of any laws that got in the way of economic freedom. He painted government oversight as a suffocating force that strangled the entrepreneurial spirit of America's founders. To him, the true strength of America lay in the hands of business leaders, not bureaucrats. As Cruz's star rose, so did his ties to corporate America. He was no stranger to big donors, the oil and gas giants, tech moguls, and Wall Street investors who lined up to fund his campaigns. Cruz became their champion, voicing their concerns in the halls of Congress, standing firm in his belief that any regulation was a threat to their success. He became the voice of corporate giants, offering them a free pass to operate without restrictions, while at the same time vilifying anyone who dared to suggest that these companies should be held accountable. His defenders hailed Cruz as a visionary, a man who would bring back the glory of a truly unregulated market. But for many, Cruz became the embodiment of everything that was wrong with American politics. The very corporations he defended were the ones that were squeezing the life out of small businesses, undermining workers' rights, and creating a system where the rich could thrive while the rest of the country struggled to keep up. For Cruz, this wasn't just about policy, it was about philosophy. He genuinely believed that the market, left to its own devices, would solve every problem. He saw himself as a knight fighting for freedom, battling against the supposed tyranny of government intervention. But his idea of freedom didn't extend to the millions of Americans who didn't have the resources to survive in a marketplace stacked against them. To Cruz, it was a matter of survival of the fittest. If you couldn't compete, you didn't deserve to. But there was one glaring contradiction in Cruz's worldview. While he railed against government control, he had no problem with corporate control. He supported the mergers and acquisitions that consolidated entire industries, often leaving consumers with fewer choices and higher prices. He turned a blind eye to the fact that the very free market he championed was being hijacked by monopolies, companies that crushed competition and treated workers like disposable assets. Cruz's vision of America was one where only the strongest survived, but in reality, it was the biggest corporations that were calling the shots. And then there was the issue of his loyalty. Cruz had long defended the interests of the ultra-wealthy, but would his rhetoric hold up when it faced the reality of everyday Americans? Could he stand by his ideals when confronted with the true human cost of his policies? At the heart of his beliefs was an unsettling truth: Cruz was willing to sacrifice the well-being of ordinary people to protect the interests of the powerful. While he spoke of liberty and freedom, his policies served only to entrench the dominance of the corporate elite. His opposition to corporate regulation wasn't just an ideological stance, it was a battle to protect his donors, his allies, and the system that had made him so successful. To Cruz, the market wasn't just a place of competition, it was the arena in which the wealthy could secure their power and keep everyone else in line. But as the debate with Warren began to intensify, it became clear that Cruz's free market rhetoric had limits. He was about to face the reality that no amount of corporate cash could shield him from the demands of the people who were tired of being crushed by the weight of monopolistic power. The mask was about to slip. Cruz had long defended the interests of the ultra-wealthy, but would his rhetoric hold up when it faced the reality of everyday Americans? The tension was palpable. The room was waiting for the first true confrontation. And as Cruz sat there, ready to continue his battle for the free market, the stakes had never been higher. Elizabeth Warren wasn't born into wealth or privilege. She didn't have the polished speech of the corporate elite or the backing of powerful donors. She grew up in the heart of Oklahoma, in a small town where money was scarce, and every family lived paycheck to paycheck. Her father, a modest salesman, had a heart attack when she was just a young girl, and the financial ruin that followed shook their family to its core. They lost their home, and for a time, the Warrens barely scraped by. From an early age, Elizabeth understood the real cost of economic hardship. It wasn't just about losing material possessions, it was about losing your dignity, your security, and your sense of possibility. Elizabeth saw firsthand the deep cracks in a system that didn't seem to care about people like her family. Her mother worked tirelessly, scraping together what little they had, but the system seemed rigged against them. It was this early exposure to the fragility of the American dream that would shape the course of her life. As Elizabeth grew older, she developed a passion for education, determined to escape the cycle of poverty that had once seemed inescapable. She worked her way through college and earned a law degree, but she wasn't content to simply climb the ladder of success for herself. She was determined to make sure that others didn't have to fight the same uphill battle that she had. Her first major battle came when she turned her attention to the financial system. As an academic and later as a law professor, Warren began studying bankruptcy law. She was horrified by what she found, the ways in which the system exploited vulnerable Americans, particularly women and minorities, leaving them with crushing debt and little hope of recovery. The more she learned, the more she realized that the system wasn't broken, it was designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Banks and credit card companies were luring vulnerable people into debt traps, while politicians in Washington turned a blind eye, accepting corporate donations and making sure the system stayed stacked in favor of the wealthy. Warren didn't just write about these injustices, she fought against them. She became a fierce advocate for consumer protection, dedicating her career to making sure that everyday Americans had the tools and the protections they needed to defend themselves against the financial system. Her research and passion led her to testify before Congress, and in 2010, she was appointed to oversee the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, an agency designed to protect consumers from predatory practices. It was a win for the American people, a victory for those who had been ignored by Wall Street and left to fend for themselves. But Warren's rise wasn't without its challenges. She was met with fierce opposition from the very industry she was trying to regulate. Corporate lobbyists, banks, and the financial industry fought her every step of the way, using their vast resources to try to tear down the CFPB before it could even get off the ground. Wall Street giants spent millions on negative ads, painting her as an enemy of the free market. Politicians who had received donations from corporate interests attacked her as a radical, trying to label her a socialist. But Elizabeth Warren wasn't deterred. She had seen firsthand the damage caused by unregulated markets, and she was determined to make the system work for the people, not just the powerful. It wasn't just about policy for Warren. It was personal. Every time she walked into a room, she carried the weight of every family she had ever met who had been hurt by corporate greed. She carried the stories of the people who had lost their homes, their jobs, their savings, and their futures. These were the people she was fighting for, and no amount of money or political opposition would stop her. For Warren, it wasn't just about politics, it was about fighting for the families who couldn't afford to be ignored by the corporate elite. Her fight for financial reform wasn't just about regulating Wall Street, it was about restoring the American dream for all Americans. It was about leveling the playing field, ensuring that everyone had the same chance to succeed, not just those born with wealth or connections. Warren's mission was to make sure that ordinary people, those who had been left behind, could have a fair shot in the economy. Warren was uniquely positioned to challenge Ted Cruz's rhetoric. While Cruz defended the system that allowed corporations to thrive at the expense of the people, Warren was a truth-teller, someone who had studied the system, lived its consequences, and dedicated her life to changing it. Cruz could spout free market dogma all he wanted, but Warren knew the reality. She knew how that rhetoric hurt real people, people who were struggling to pay their bills, to put food on the table, to save for their children's futures. For Warren, the fight wasn't ideological. It was a fight for justice, for fairness, and for the future of the nation she loved. Elizabeth Warren wasn't some political figure hiding behind lofty promises. She was a fighter, and she had been fighting for the people her entire life. Every decision she made, every policy she championed, came from the core belief that the economy should work for everyone, not just the wealthy few. Her entire career had been built on challenging the powerful, exposing the truth, and fighting for the voiceless. And now, in this room, facing Ted Cruz, Warren was about to take on the system once again, this time, on the biggest stage of all. The stakes were higher than ever before, and she wasn't going to back down. The room is thick with tension as Ted Cruz leans forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. His voice drips with sarcasm as he turns to Warren, making sure to project every syllable to the back of the room. "Senator Warren," Cruz begins, his smile wide but his eyes narrowing with thinly veiled contempt, "you love to talk about corporate greed and the need for regulation. But let's be honest, what you really want is more government control. The last thing we need in this country is more government. We need freedom. We need a government that steps out of the way, not one that stifles innovation with taxes, rules, and red tape." Warren doesn't flinch. Her hands are steady, her expression calm as she looks directly at Cruz. She's heard this rhetoric 1,000 times, but she knows the stakes are higher now than ever before. "Senator Cruz," she begins, her voice controlled, but with the sharpness of a woman who's spent her career facing down powerful forces, "the real danger isn't too much government, it's too much corporate power. When corporations can run roughshod over workers, consumers, and even entire communities, we lose something far more precious than some supposed free market utopia. We lose our democracy." Cruz snickers, shaking his head as though Warren's words are little more than naive idealism. "Democracy?" he repeats, raising an eyebrow. "Democracy is about freedom, Senator. And the freedom to succeed. The freedom to create jobs, to grow businesses, to allow Americans to rise based on their talent and ambition. What you're proposing is a government that dictates the terms of success, that punishes success for the sake of the few who can't keep up. The tension in the room rises. Cruz's words hang in the air like a challenge, and the crowd's anticipation grows with each passing moment. It's clear Cruz is enjoying this, basking in his ability to twist Warren's message, to paint her as an enemy of progress. But Warren remains poised. You talk about freedom, Senator, but what about the freedom of the worker who's been left behind by a corporate system that pays them less and less while making record profits? What about the consumer who's getting gouged at the gas pump or the pharmacy counter? These aren't just abstract concepts, these are real people, real families. You speak of freedom, but where is the freedom for them? The room shifts. A murmur spreads as the truth of her words cuts through the rhetoric. Cruz's face tightens, but he refuses to give an inch. Do you honestly think the answer is bigger government? Cruz retorts, his voice rising in frustration. Do you honestly believe that the same people who have made a mess of Washington can fix anything? It's laughable. More government means more inefficiency, more control, more burdens on businesses that are already struggling to keep up. His tone is sharper now, less confident, but more biting. The crowd can sense it. Cruz is rattled, but he's not going down without a fight. He leans back in his chair, trying to regain his composure, but Warren doesn't let him catch his breath. No, Senator, she replies, leaning forward, eyes unwavering. What's laughable is thinking that corporations, with their billions in profits, should be allowed to operate without any oversight or responsibility. It's not the government that's breaking the system, it's the corporate giants that are putting their profits over people. And that is something we cannot afford to ignore any longer. The crowd is on edge. Cruz's earlier confidence is slipping, but he's determined to land a final blow. You think the answer is regulation? Cruz sneers. You think that government intervention will fix all the problems you've been talking about? You're dreaming. What you want isn't progress, it's control. You want to make America just another bureaucratic mess, just like every other socialist disaster across the globe. Warren's response is calm, but the fire in her eyes is undeniable. It's not socialism, Senator. It's called accountability. It's called protecting the people who need it the most. It's called making sure that no one, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, can take advantage of the system and leave others behind. The room falls silent. The air crackles with tension. The stakes are no longer just about policy, they are about the very heart of what America stands for. On one side, Cruz represents a world where corporations reign unchecked, where the rich continue to grow richer and the rest of the country is left behind. On the other, Warren is fighting for a vision where fairness, responsibility, and the well-being of the people come before profits. But Cruz isn't backing down. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you, Elizabeth? Cruz taunts, his words dripping with disdain. Well, we'll see how far that big government rhetoric gets you. Because what you don't seem to realize is that this country was built on the very principles you're trying to tear down. The room feels like it's holding its breath. The back and forth has escalated, but this next moment could be the one that changes everything. Cruz is desperately trying to regain control, but Warren's steady, calculated responses are slowly chipping away at his argument. The tension was so thick, you could almost feel it. But what happened next would shatter the room. The room hangs in suspense as Cruz's words echo through the chamber, but Elizabeth Warren remains calm, composed, unshaken. She leans slightly forward, her gaze fixed firmly on Cruz, before turning to address the room. I understand why you feel that way, Senator, she begins, her voice still steady, but with a tone that betrays an underlying strength. It must be nice to live in a world where corporations are treated as people, where billion-dollar companies get tax breaks while millions of hard-working Americans are left to pick up the pieces. But you and I know something different, don't we? The tension in the room grows as Warren pauses, her gaze sweeping over the audience. They're on the edge of their seats. Warren has always been known for her ability to bring clarity to complex issues, and now, she's about to make her case. The weight of her words seems to settle over the room, the moment before the storm. Let's talk about what's actually happening to the people of this country, she continues, her voice unwavering. Because I've spent years listening to their stories, studying the numbers, and talking to the families who've been hurt by corporate greed. These aren't just abstract ideas, Senator. These are real people whose lives have been shattered because of the unchecked power you're defending. She pulls up a chart on the screen behind her, a simple bar graph. The audience leans in, curiosity piqued. The chart compares the staggering rise in corporate profits over the last 2 decades with the stagnation of wages for average American workers. Corporate profits have more than doubled over the past 20 years, Senator, she says, her finger pointing to the graph. Meanwhile, wages for workers have barely budged. In fact, the average worker is making less today, adjusted for inflation, than they were 40 years ago. And yet, in the same period, corporate executives have seen their pay soar to unimaginable heights, 278 times the average worker's salary. She lets that fact land with a thud, her voice cutting through the growing murmurs of the room. Cruz shifts uncomfortably, but he remains silent, for now. The American people are not blind, Senator, Warren continues, her voice more resolute now. They know what's going on. They know that when corporations pay no taxes, when they hide their profits in offshore accounts, when they lobby for tax cuts while simultaneously slashing wages, they're stealing from the very people who keep this country running. She looks Cruz directly in the eye, a piercing gaze that no longer feels like a mere political exchange, but something much deeper. You stand here defending those corporate interests, while working families are getting crushed under the weight of rising healthcare costs, stagnant wages, and skyrocketing student loan debt. Your constituents, your voters, are the ones paying the price, while the people you're defending get richer. And that's not just bad economics. It's morally wrong. The silence in the room is deafening. Cruz's jaw clenches, but he doesn't interrupt. His usual smirk is nowhere to be found. He knows what's coming next. Warren steps forward, her next words poised to pierce through the last remaining defenses of Cruz's argument. Let me tell you about the mother of 3 who came to my office just last week. She works 2 jobs, barely making enough to cover her rent and feed her children. But every time she tries to make ends meet, the rent goes up, the prices at the grocery store climb higher, and the wages stay the same. She can't afford healthcare, she can't afford daycare, and she can't afford to get sick. And do you know why? Because of the very corporate greed you defend. Warren pauses again, letting the weight of her words sink in. She takes a breath, and for a moment, the room seems to hang in suspended animation, like they're all waiting for a resolution that has yet to come. But you don't care about her, Warren continues, her voice dropping with the conviction of someone who's been fighting this fight for years. You don't care about the families who are drowning in debt because they've been sold predatory loans, or the students who are buried under student loan debt because corporations like for-profit colleges scam them out of their futures. You care about the people who fund your campaigns, the ones who've made billions off the backs of workers, the ones who've used their power to keep you in office. The words land with such force that the audience can feel the tension rise like a wave. Cruz's face has gone pale, his fists clenched under the table, his earlier bravado now replaced with something resembling unease. Now, let's talk about the hypocrisy of it all, Warren says, her voice cutting through the silence. You've spent your entire career railing against government interference. But you, Senator Cruz, are not some free market champion. You're the biggest cheerleader for the corporate welfare state that's been propped up by government policies, tax breaks, and subsidies. You fought for the deregulation of the financial industry, the oil and gas companies, and the tech giants that manipulated the system to enrich themselves. And all the while, you've stood by, telling the American people that it's for their benefit. She pauses and takes a slow, deliberate breath. Cruz shifts again, but it's no longer a confident shift. It's the shift of a man trying to avoid the truth that's beginning to close in on him. Senator Cruz, Warren says, her voice sharp, clear, and unwavering, you can't keep pretending that you're on the side of the people when every policy you support benefits the corporate elite and leaves the working class behind. You can't say you believe in a free market when that market is rigged in favor of the rich. You can't pretend to be the defender of freedom when all you're doing is enabling a system that crushes the people you claim to represent. The silence in the room is almost tangible. Cruz, who had been so vocal just moments before, now sits frozen. His mouth opens, but no words come out. The damage has been done. The crowd is no longer just listening, they're absorbing the weight of what has just been revealed. Some of the more conservative members of the audience shift uncomfortably, while others watch Cruz with a mix of disbelief and anticipation. For the first time, Cruz looks uncertain, like he's lost control of the conversation, a man caught in the web of his own contradictions. The tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. But as Warren steps back, her final words hang in the air, ringing through the room like a final, resounding truth. The truth is undeniable, Senator. And you can try to dodge it, but you can't erase the reality that corporate greed has become the greatest threat to our democracy. And until we hold these corporations accountable, the American people will continue to suffer. The room erupts into murmurs, and Cruz, finally losing his composure, starts to respond, but it's too late. Warren has won. Her voice has risen, clear and strong, and the weight of her argument has left Cruz on the defensive, fumbling for a response that no longer matters. The moment the debate ended, the world didn't just return to business as usual. No, this wasn't just another political clash. This was a cultural earthquake, one that reverberated across social media, broadcast news, and the very fabric of public discourse. It began almost immediately. The second Warren finished her mic drop counterattack, the hashtag Warren wins started trending. First, it was just a trickle, a few tweets from political pundits and policy experts applauding her precision. But within minutes, it exploded into a full-blown viral movement. Tweets, memes, and posts flooded social media, pouring out with enthusiasm, anger, and a renewed sense of hope for those who had been waiting for a voice that could finally challenge corporate greed. #BigCorpFail was another hashtag that quickly gained traction. It wasn't just about the debate anymore, it was about a larger reckoning with the corporate powers that had held the nation in their grip for decades. People were watching the fallout in real time, connecting the dots between Warren's argument and their own lived experiences. Everywhere you looked, stories began to pour in, about families struggling to pay medical bills, students buried under debt, workers who hadn't seen a raise in years while CEOs raked in millions. Celebrities, influencers, and activists took to their platforms to amplify the message. Elizabeth Warren just dropped the truth bomb of the decade. It's time for real change. #Warren wins #corporate greed, tweeted actress and activist Aisha Ray. Her post was shared by hundreds of thousands within hours, each share acting as a small wave in the growing tsunami of support. Political commentators were buzzing. On MSNBC, Chris Hayes praised Warren's decisive performance, calling it a moment of moral clarity that cut through Cruz's hollow rhetoric. This isn't just about policy, folks. This is about a moral reckoning with the corporate interests that have hijacked our democracy, Hayes declared, his voice rising with the intensity of the moment. The applause from the studio audience only added fuel to the fire. On the other side, conservative media outlets scrambled to defend Cruz, but their efforts were increasingly futile. News anchors were already calling it the defining debate of the year. On Twitter, a poll was launched: who won the debate? Within an hour, Warren led Cruz by an overwhelming 75%. The results shocked even the most seasoned political analysts, who had expected the debate to be a tight race. The narrative was shifting, and it was shifting fast. But it wasn't just the progressive circles that were reacting. Even some moderate Republicans began to express doubt about Cruz's defense of corporate power. "I've always supported free markets," said Senator John Halliday, a Republican from Pennsylvania, "but what we saw last night wasn't about the free market. It was about corporate elites getting a free pass to do whatever they want." Warren made a compelling case for regulating Wall Street, and we can't ignore that. The comment was quickly picked up by major news outlets, further fracturing Cruz's support. Yet, Cruz's defenders were nothing if not determined. Conservative pundits like Tucker Carlson began to double down on their usual rhetoric, attacking Warren's policies as socialist and dangerous. But even their usual bag of tricks seemed worn out. "You know, Warren would have you believe that corporate America is the villain in every story," Carlson sneered on his show. "But the truth is, it's government that's the real enemy here." But for every conservative talking head trying to pivot the conversation back to the tired old tropes, there was a chorus of people who weren't buying it anymore. The public wasn't in the mood for business-as-usual political rhetoric. Warren's victory had hit a nerve, and it wasn't going to be so easily dismissed. Social media continued to explode with reactions. Instagram was flooded with memes of Warren's final, crushing lines, "The truth is undeniable, Senator. And you can try to dodge it, but you can't erase the reality that corporate greed has become the greatest threat to our democracy." The captions paired with the memes were filled with sharp commentary. Warren just dropped the mic on Cruz. Corporate greed has no place in America. And then, in the world of TikTok, young people began to share their personal stories of how corporate policies had negatively affected their lives. College students posted videos of themselves discussing student debt, young workers talked about stagnant wages, and even small business owners shared how big corporations had squeezed them out of their markets. The hashtag #BigCorpFail morphed into a rallying cry that united millions of voices, young and old, across the country. It was no longer just about a political fight. It was about reclaiming power from the corporate titans who had long dominated the American system. But it wasn't just the common people reacting. Politicians were feeling the pressure. Progressive figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders praised Warren's performance as a turning point for the nation. "Warren has laid down the gauntlet," Sanders said in a tweet. "She showed America that we have the power to push back against corporate greed and take our democracy back." Meanwhile, Cruz's supporters began to sound increasingly desperate. One of his top donors, oil magnate and billionaire Harold Jennings, issued a statement in support of his candidate, but even the carefully crafted response seemed to lack conviction. "Senator Cruz remains committed to the principles of freedom and prosperity," it read. "We will continue to fight for the economic policies that have made America great." But even this tone-deaf reply couldn't shield Cruz from the growing discontent. His usual supporters, who had once championed his fight against government overreach, began to quietly distance themselves. "We're all for free markets, but this isn't about free markets anymore," one former ally of Cruz was quoted as saying. "This is about keeping the corporate world unchecked, and that's just not what the people want." As the night wore on, the feeling in the media and on social media was clear: Warren had not just won the debate, she had reshaped the narrative. The status quo was no longer safe. The fight against corporate dominance had become a movement, one that had found its voice, and its leader. Cruz's defenses, built on years of ideological rhetoric, had begun to crumble under the weight of Warren's irrefutable facts and moral clarity. By morning, the pundits weren't talking about whether Cruz had won. They were talking about the future of corporate regulation, the need for reform, and the rise of a new political reckoning. Elizabeth Warren had done more than win a debate, she had sparked a national conversation. And the impact was only beginning. As the debate faded into the background, the world began to understand something more profound. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This was a battle for the soul of America, a defining moment that would leave a lasting mark on the future of the nation. And in that moment, Elizabeth Warren had not just won a debate, she had brought the fight to the heart of what America was meant to be. Standing before the camera, in the aftermath of the debate, Warren took a deep breath. The noise of the media and the social media firestorm were still ringing in her ears, but now, it was time to look beyond the rhetoric, beyond the heated exchanges. This was about the larger picture, the fight for fairness, for accountability, and for a future where the economy worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. "The debate may be over, but the fight is far from finished," Warren began, her voice calm, yet filled with an unwavering resolve. What happened here wasn't just a political battle. It was a moral one. A battle over the kind of country we want to live in. And it was a battle for the people, the workers, the families, the entrepreneurs, the dreamers, and the everyday Americans who have been left behind by a system that is rigged in favor of the rich and powerful. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle in, then continued, "For too long, corporate greed has dictated our politics. For too long, we've allowed the wealthiest corporations to get away with manipulating our laws, hiding their profits, and driving down wages while reaping the rewards of government bailouts and tax breaks. They've had the power, they've had the influence, and they've had the resources. But what they never counted on was the power of the people." Warren's voice rose as she spoke, every word a reflection of the passion she had carried with her for years. "This is not just about holding corporations accountable. It's about restoring balance to the American dream. It's about giving people the chance to succeed, not because they have the most money, but because they have the will, the skill, and the heart to build something for themselves and their families. It's about giving every American a fair shot, no matter where they come from, how much money they have, or the color of their skin." She took another breath, the tension from the debate still fresh, but now transformed into something more powerful. This was the message she had been fighting for her entire career. A vision for an America that wasn't just about who could pay the most to influence the system, but about a nation where fairness and justice were at the core of its economy. Because, at the end of the day, this fight isn't just about one debate, or one election. It's about our values, Warren continued, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. It's about dignity. It's about fairness. It's about the simple truth that every person in this country, no matter who they are, deserves to have a fair shot. A shot at a good job, a good education, a healthy life, and a future where they don't have to choose between paying for medicine or putting food on the table. Warren's words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was a silence that spoke louder than any applause. She had reframed the battle, not as a political struggle, but as a moral one. And in doing so, she had made it clear that the fight for corporate accountability was not just a policy debate, it was a fight for the soul of the nation. This was a battle not just for policy but for the soul of America. And America chose to stand with the people, she said, her eyes scanning the camera, a solemn yet hopeful expression on her face. We chose to stand for fairness. We chose to stand for justice. We chose to stand for the values that make this country great, values that transcend party lines, values that connect us as Americans. And that is a victory we can all share. Warren's tone softened, but the power in her message remained. I know this isn't easy. The road ahead is long, and the forces we're up against are powerful. But we are stronger than they think. We have the power to demand change. And we have the power to make that change happen. Her voice grew even softer, but her conviction was undeniable. This is our moment. This is our chance to build an economy that works for everyone, where the people, not the corporations, are in control. Where we hold the powerful accountable, where we fight for what's right, and where we never stop believing in the promise of America. Because the truth is, if we stand together, there's nothing we can't do. Warren paused, her eyes shining with the strength of someone who had been fighting for this cause for decades. And as she concluded, her message wasn't just for the moment, it was a call to action that would continue long after the debate was over. The work doesn't stop here, she said, her voice now filled with the force of a movement that could not be ignored. It's just beginning. The room was silent for a beat, then, like a wave, the applause began. It was slow at first, unsure, but then it grew louder, more confident. The message had been delivered, and it was undeniable. For Warren, this was more than just a victory in a political battle. It was the beginning of something bigger, a movement that demanded fairness, demanded accountability, and demanded a better future for all Americans. And the nation had heard it. They weren't just watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a turning point in the fight for America's soul. Warren's victory wasn't just hers. It was a victory for all of us, a victory for the ordinary people who've spent far too long watching from the sidelines as corporate greed runs unchecked. This battle, this debate, was about more than just political differences. It was about the soul of America. It was about standing up against a system that has long favored the wealthy few at the expense of everyone else. And Elizabeth Warren didn't just win on that stage. She won for every family struggling to make ends meet, for every worker fighting for fair wages, for every student buried under debt, and for every person who believes that justice, dignity, and fairness should be the foundation of this country. What we witnessed was a turning point. A moment when the voices of the people grew louder than the influence of corporate money, a moment that gave hope to millions who felt forgotten, overlooked, and underrepresented. And now, the question is, what will we do with this moment? This is just the beginning. If Warren's fight has taught us anything, it's that the power is in our hands. We have the power to demand a better, fairer system. We have the power to hold those in power accountable. But we cannot do it alone. That's where you come in. If you believe that corporate greed has no place in our future, if you believe that the people deserve a voice, then it's time to take action. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed, share this message with everyone who needs to hear it, and become part of the movement for a fairer, more just America. Together, we can rewrite the rules. Together, we can create the future we deserve. It starts now.